Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Evidence Quarter. I'm Sarah Cumbers. I'm the chair of the Evidence Quarter, and it's my pleasure to host you here this evening, and also hello to those of you who are joining us online. And this is the next event in our series of Better Evidence, Better Government events, and the fifth session that we've run as a hybrid event. So first of all, the standard housekeeping, we're not expecting any fire alarms, but if there is one, a Frankie at the back in the green dress will lead everybody to the muster point in St James's Park. There are toilets at the back. Please check your phone to make sure it's on silent. And finally, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end, and it's what makes the event. So please do get your thinking caps on while Will and Bobby are in conversation. And if you're joining us online, please do post your questions in the chat, and our moderators will pick those up and feed them through. So a little bit about the Evidence Quarter before we start. We bring together leading evidence organisations to share a physical space here at Albany House to increase collaboration together and to address joint challenges. But we're far more than just an office space. We're working to build a community of research, policy and evaluation enthusiasts through our events and our partnerships. And so tonight's event series is one of those important opportunities. And so we really are connecting people in evidence and research and policy making to come together to share ideas. And tonight, obviously, is another great example of that. It's part of our Better Evidence, Better Government series. And we've brought together a host of well-known speakers from government, from academia, and from evidence-led organisations to raise the profile of the role of evidence in policy making. The Policy Institute at King's, who we're delighted to co-host the event with us, works to solve society's challenges with evidence and expertise. And so we're very pleased to be working with you again. And following on from our previous events, we've had David Halpin here, Lord Gus O'Donnell, Professor Brooke Rogers, and Professor Andrew Oswald. We're delighted to welcome Will Moy, Chief Executive of the Campbell Collaboration. And so just an introduction to our two speakers tonight. Professor Bobby Duffy is Professor of Public Policy and also Director of the Policy Institute at King's. He's worked across most public policy areas in his career of 30 years in policy research and evaluation, including being seconded to the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Bobby sits on several advisory boards, and I'm not going to list them all, but there's an impressive list. And he's also got a couple of books, so please do look those up as well if you are interested. And then turning to Will, as I mentioned, CEO of the Campbell Collaboration, where I think you've been there for about 6 months, haven't you? And the Campbell Collaboration, if you don't know, is an international social science network. And prior to that, Will was the director at Full Fact, the UK's only independent fact-checking organisation, and was there from 2010 through 3 referendums, the Leveson inquiry into press standards and the European Parliamentary 2015 and 2017 general elections. So it must have been a really, really interesting time, and we're very much looking forward to this conversation this evening. It's a critical time in UK politics, obviously, and there's never been a greater need for us to underline the importance of evidence in policy making. So without further ado, I will hand over to Bobby, who's going to set the scene and introduce our topic for this evening. Bobby.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for coming and for organising this event. I mean, I really enjoyed this series of events, and the thing that I've enjoyed, I guess, the thing that sets it apart in many ways is being able to actually talk to someone for a while, not just about the issues, but about how they got here, where they came from, what they've learned, and all of the kind of journey of this, because I think that's really, really important. So I'm going to start with Will, just asking him about your career, where you've come from, what you've been through, where you've got to now. But before you do, I just want to say, because you're too modest, and you won't say some of the things about Full Fact that is really worth celebrating. Because you just look through all the lists of achievements and how you have been lauded by so many different people, by the BBC as a beacon for accuracy and meticulousness in a world of half-truths and unsubstantiated assertions, by House of Commons, UK Parliament committees, for the role you play in informing public debate. The only organisation to ever win the British Academy President's Medal, which is a real achievement. And then just this kind of increase in scale of this, from 3 people to 50 people over your tenure and now used by millions of people around the world to check facts. So it's amazing achievements. But Will, just over to you then. Just tell us a little bit about how you started out, how you got on that sort of journey, where you've ended up.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Bobby, and thank you all for coming. Slightly odd to be the subject of a conversation. I'm used to speaking on behalf of Full Fact or Campbell and not myself. Thank you for that introduction, but it's really important to say that Full Fact was the first ever team to be given the British Academy's President Medal, and it was a team, and it was a really important thing for the British Academy to recognise those were team achievements. So obviously I'm going to talk about myself for the next however long, but it's really important to see it in that light. Very briefly, I worked in IT just before I went to university. I did a gap year. And then I went to university, left. I was an admin for the all-party group on transport safety. All-party groups are sort of semi-formal groupings of MPs, by definition, of all parties working together on a particular issue. And then after doing that for a couple of years, I wanted to work in Parliament in a non-party political job. A wonderful guy called Colin Lowe had just been made a member of the House of Lords as a crossbench peer. Lord Lowe was blind. I became his human guide dog. So we wandered around the House of Lords for 3.5 years with 3 ears and 2 eyes between us, working on equality legislation, regulatory legislation, and many other things. Colin's an extraordinary, impressive man. I learned so much from that experience going everywhere he went for that time. He, before, as well as being one of the great disability rights advocates in this country, he was also a criminology lecturer for 20 years, and he's actually Keir Starmer's criminology lecturer.
Yeah.
So connected in all kinds of interesting ways. Then, because I read everything that was sent to Lord Lowe, that was my job. I got annoyed by the amount of nonsense that was being used to lobby people making very important decisions and sometimes turning up in very significant decision making. And at that same time, I read Peter Obon's book, The Rise of Political Lying, which documents exactly what it says. Slightly contentiously dates the rise of political lying from when Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party. I think other people might probably that timeline slightly further back. But he said, look, in the US, we have this fact-checking organization called factcheck.org, and we need one of those in the UK. So like any sensible person, I tried to get other people to do it, and that sort of backfired, and I ended up trying to encourage people to set one up. And because I'd worked in the Lords where nobody really has assistants, that's very rare. And so I'd worked directly with senior people from all the major political parties. I was able to write to 3 of them, one from each major party, say, is this a good idea? And within 48 hours, they'd all come back saying, this sounds like a really good idea. And that does not happen unless there's something in it. So eventually, a group of them got together with some wonderful experts in media, Jean Seaton and John Lloyd, and launched Full Fact. And in September 2010, I became the boss of Full Fact, ran it for 13 years. We did some good in the world. We built an extraordinary team. And then last year I left. It's a relay race. I handed over the baton to someone else. And now I'm in charge of supporting the hundreds, if not thousands, of members of the Campbell collaboration, which is an amazing global collaboration of researchers trying to bring all the evidence on important public policy questions together so it can be used.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So yeah, let's have a little focus on Campbell collaboration, because I don't know how many people are familiar with Campbell collaboration. Show of hands. There you go, Will. You've got your work cut out in.
We're the one just before the pillar.
Oh, it's on there. It's on the wall. Yeah. Gosh, there you go. We should all have seen that. So let's a bit of an outline of Campbell.
So the Campbell collaboration, I think, is the biggest and most important social science project since the dictionary. It is an attempt to bring together everything the world knows about vital questions, about how we organize ourselves as a society, how we run the country, how we run education, how we reduce crime, all of the really important public policy questions, and make that information organized and rigorously assessed and filtered and useful for decision making. And I think if we can take the the really great primary research that is done in so many social science areas and turn it into useful, synthesized, tested or information, we can make a really powerful difference to the quality of decision making. And that's not a theory, that's a proven reality in many areas. Campbell collaboration's been going for 25 years. And in some areas, it's made a really big difference already. So, for example, in crime and justice, there's a wonderful, what we call a coordinating group, one of the topic expert groups within Campbell, which has people who have been very senior in the police, people who've been very senior in public policy, and people who are top of their game academically working together to bring knowledge to bear. So, for example, when you say we should send young people who misbehave to boot camp, we have completely authoritative summary of all the research saying that will do more harm than good. And believe me, more than one Home Secretary has said that, and being presented with a clear synthesis of the evidence saying, no, don't do that, Minister, and it won't achieve the thing you want it to achieve is actually a really powerful and helpful thing. Campbell was inspired by and is a sister organization to a Cochrane collaboration, which is much better known, summarizes all of the research about, for example, when to prescribe a drug so doctors can use it. And obviously that's easier in medicine than in public policy. There's a whole set of different methods, challenges, and political challenges about summarizing evidence to inform political decision-making and decision-making about social issues. But that's one of the things that makes Campbell, I think, so important and so interesting. And I guess from my point of view, seeing great research that is underappreciated, undersupported, and underused feels like it fits my skill set, which is helping make the case for important evidence and for evidence being used. And so that seemed complementary, but it also did something I talked about in a lecture that Bobby kind enough to sit through a few years ago about the Royal Statistical Society, which Sarah now runs. One of the things I think is striking about social science is that it tends not to value teamwork so obviously as in the so-called hard sciences. So more and more you see big collaborative efforts in hard sciences. It's recognized as the only way to get things done. In social science, it doesn't feel like either structurally or funding-wise, there's that same recognition of the necessity of teamwork to get things done. The Campbell collaboration is a fantastic global team of people working together to do something very important in life, and being able to serve that group is something that matters to me. And it ticks a bunch of other boxes, but I've talked long enough.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense. And it's really interesting about collaboration. I always think of social sciences as collaborative in many ways, but I guess it's and multidisciplinary and trying to bring things together, and that's where you see the greatest impact. But I guess that's exactly what you're trying to encourage. Yeah. So I just want to get more onto the kind of substantive points about the evidence into policy and practice, kind of where we are, where we come from. And it'd just be good to get an idea over the course of your career, what changes you've noticed in that, what progress we've made, what stayed the same, what we've gone backwards on, maybe, pulling on that full fact time, and how the environment has changed as well hugely in that time in terms of information environment, political environment, all those types of things. Where are we? Where have we ended up?
Yeah, answers on a postcard. I think the changing information environment is fascinating, and I don't think people realize how fundamental a social shift has gone on with the fact that, let's say when the Falklands War happened, most households in this country watched the 6 o'clock news. When the Ukraine war happened, only 2 million households roughly were watching the 6 o'clock news. There is simply no outlet, no platform, and no channel where you can talk to the whole of the country, or even the majority of the country, or anything close to the country anymore. The shared reality that is a necessary part of democracy has fragmented into thousands of different channels. And that's, in one sense, hugely exciting, because we democratize the ability to reach audiences. And of course, Full Fact is a product of that opportunity. We were able to reach ultimately tens of millions of people in 1 year in 2020 in a way that simply would have been impossible even, I think, 10 years before. But at the same time, it means that anything that depends on getting a shared message out to everybody becomes extraordinarily difficult. And that's what we saw during the pandemic. It was only the most hardcore spending, use of platforms, daily TV conferences, which people couldn't leave their homes, so watched in large numbers, and also taking over the homepages of some of the internet's biggest properties and so on and so forth, that could get a message out to the majority of the country. And that's an extraordinary shift. You see so many public information and public analysis-based organizations that still behave as if getting on the front page of the newspapers has anything like the impact it did 5 years ago. And it's factually wrong. And it's a real misunderstanding of how you achieve the kinds of changes that you can achieve through communication. So I think that's really a fascinating shift. But underlying sort of that big underlying fact that really has consequences that need to be worked through, just some thoughts about changes over time. One is the sort of big picture of the bad information space that I've been working in for the last 13 years is it's not one big problem, it's lots of separate problems. And the only way you start solving it is by breaking it down into separate problems and solving those. So we saw amazing changes. Daily Mail, which I was told by the country's leading expert in media standards would never print a single correction, set up a corrections column and regularly prints corrections within hours or days when Full Fact points out an error in its coverage. That's a massive cultural change that we've seen at The Sun as well. And in the newspaper industry, it's not everything, but it's an important shift. Last year, the House of Commons voted to introduce corrections column for all MPs. It only existed for government ministers before because Full Fact pointed out that gap, called it out, got a procedure committee inquiring, we made that change. The Statistics Authority changed its point of view from we publish the statistics and it's up to you to what you do with them, to we need to take account of how people use the statistics we publish and if they're being misunderstood, change the way we publish them to avoid those misunderstandings. Those are really interesting, powerful examples of breaking down the problem, finding solvable parts of the problem and doing things. And they make me optimistic about what we can do to improve the use of evidence more generally in government. But just a final thought on that sort of period of change. When you started Full Fact, it's a large team of us, but the thing that people would have been talking about then was spin. Tail end of the Labour government, context of the Iraq war, et cetera, et cetera. That's what people are talking about at that time. Then we have the Leveson inquiry, Millie Dowler's phone being hacked, press standards in a kind of brutal and very vivid sense coming to the fore. Then we have a Scottish independence referendum, a more violent streak of politics becoming much more evident, and online slightly vicious activism being a more visible part of political debate. And we get, of course, the European parliamentary elections, the UKIP won, leading to the referendum in 2016. And suddenly we're all talking about fake news, Trump gets elected, and there's that whole era, and we're talking about political standards and so on and so forth. The Skripal poisoning, and then we're talking about misinformation and particularly disinformation in a state-sponsored context as a national security issue, and then the pandemic where we're talking about it as a public health issue. Of course, Full Fact has talked to people operating in all of those spaces, and it's so interesting because people tend to see information integrity from one of those particular angles. And public health people tend to see it in a particular light. National security people and people who do countering violent extremism see it in a very different light. People who worry about public standards see it in a different light. But there's a whole set of shared concerns about what good evidence looks like, how you communicate it effectively, how you get to audiences and so on, that are not necessarily understood in a shared way. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for everyone who wants good information to be used well in public life. You probably have heard of the parable of the 5 blind men and an elephant, where one holds the trunk, one holds the tail, one holds the leg, one holds the body. They all think they're holding completely different things. And I think a lot of people who are interested in well-informed decision-making are holding a different part of a very big elephant and thinking they're doing something completely different from a bunch of other people they could actually be working with and learning from.
It's so interesting. Yeah, those different demarcations of different things. So with Full Fact at a nexus of that, because you are trying to correct it. I mean, is that...
We sit at a nexus because we deal with specific examples.
And
it's one of the things that keeps Full Fact honest, is you're not a sort of think tank talking about how the world could be better in some abstract way. You're day in, day out, you're looking at specific examples of things being got wrong and then saying, trace that back. What was the failure mode that led to this particular error? And then where in the chain could you intervene to avoid that failure mode?
Yeah. So how do we need to connect those different views of the elephant? What's your thinking on that? How do you actually get that?
I think This should be a conversation, and this is the question that I rack my brain about. Why does this so-called evidence community not act communally? And the evidence quarter is such a great example of the opportunity of doing so and the importance of doing so. But actually, when I look at some of the government decisions about how much it prioritizes evidence, I wonder why we aren't as effective at collectively making a case that as we could be. And I wonder why there isn't a collective case that we're clearly all arguing for. So what you see is absolute excellence in some areas where particular institutions and often particular individuals have built relationships with decision makers, and there's an understanding of the opportunity, and there's mutual trust, and there's funding, and you get good evidence and it gets used. And a desert in other areas. And a real, I think, systematic gap in how we use evidence and our level of ambition for how we used evidence. And that's why I deliberately describe Campbell in terms of covering the whole dictionary. Like, how can we summarize all of social science for public policy and make it useful? Not just how can we do some systematic reviews and get them used in some decisions, because that's the scale of ambition I would like to see. Excellent. I don't think we have yet learned to really work together to collectively articulate that. And I think, so I've started working with evaluation experts a lot recently and working about how evaluation and evidence synthesis can work together. I used to work a lot with statisticians. Some of my favorite people are statisticians. Got the government science advisors, and a lot of them sort of identify themselves as we do the evidence bit, which is great, but we all do the evidence bit, and there's a collective offer. And of course, let's talk about the economists. They definitely identify themselves as we do the evidence bit, and everyone else can come along if they really must. And there's so much more opportunity, I think, to work collectively that I feel is under-harnessed, and I don't quite understand what the barriers are, and I'm really interested in how you pull that together. I have two quick thoughts about it. One is that people invest in people, and the places that are working best have particular individuals who are well trusted, who have built reputations and so on. But then you have to build up people like that. You can't just hope they come along. And the other is that numbers move numbers. And one of the things that has really surprised me, both in the statistics world and in the evidence synthesis world, which I know best, is the difficulty we have making clear value for money and return on investment arguments. And I don't quite understand why the most numerate people in the country aren't making numbers-based arguments for getting money in the way I would expect.
Yeah, really good thought. And just on that's kind of on the supply side or the connection side, but just on the demand side from government and others. I mean, one of the headings you gave me for this session was "Government Chooses Ignorance."
Yes.
Which was drawing on your great Beveridge lecture, which I did see. It was excellent. And obviously relating it to Beveridge's evils. If you can give me give us a bit of a take on on the prevalence and dangers of ignorance and how you see it from a government perspective.
Well, let's start from the opposite, the opportunity, which I suspect if you're in this room, you already know. But getting the right piece of evidence can dramatically change our ability to solve social problems. That's the opportunity. And the question is, why don't we do that? If you look at the history of human progress over the last 100 years, it is built on a pyramid of knowledge that we've been stacking up over time. So dramatic drops in child mortality, dramatic increases in life expectancy, in people's ability to enjoy their lives, all built on knowledge, research, evidence. And yet in individual cases, it's really hard to make the case that small amounts of money would actually make a difference to the world. So the example that's stuck in my head that I mentioned in that lecture is crime. The Public Administration Committee did a inquiry into crime statistics some years ago, some of you may remember, and you may be surprised to learn we do not have comparable figures for who's been a victim of crime between police authorities. So police force level, we cannot compare who's been a victim of crime. We have the police force's own data, which essentially measures what police activity there has been. But the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which measures who's been a victim of crime, only goes down to, I think, regional level, but not police force area level. Now, it would cost £18 million to bring it down to police force area level, which is nothing compared to the police budget. And if you don't believe that we could spend £18 million better if we had comparable data between police forces, I'd be quite surprised, because it seems to me to be very obvious that there's a huge return on investment to be able to make meaningful comparisons between police force areas. But the select committee noted that and didn't even recommend that the government should do it. The government is aware of that and doesn't think they should fund it. And I find that extraordinary. I really do. It flummoxes me that that is a hard value for money argument to make. Whereas Sport England, which spends money trying to get people to have active, healthy lifestyles, has what used to be called the Active People Survey. I think they changed the name now. They have local authority level data on who plays golf. Now, I think that's brilliant, because I think it's important that we have healthy lifestyles, and it's important that we spend Sport England's money well. But if you think it's important that we do that, why on earth don't you think it's important that we have meaningful data about who's been a victim of violent crime? Why? So that is the government using ignorance. It's an obvious payoff. It's extraordinarily low cost in the context of what we spend on police. And it's a very easy thing to do, because the ONS is already set up to do that work. And I think if you look around, there are so many areas where there are basic data gaps, or gaps in analysis, or gaps in synthesis, so that the data and the analysis aren't being communicated to decision makers in effective ways. And again, it comes down to, how are we failing to make the case to the decision makers who can move budgets that there is a real value for money in this, and there is a real payoff to this. Obviously, it's their responsibility, but if we're the ones who are meant to be leading from our side, it's our job to make that case.
Yeah, and that, in your view, is through working together, investing in people, and numbers to move numbers. That's the kind of
absolutely. We've got to make, you've got to look at it from an accountant's point of view. You've got to be able to make the numbers-based argument for spending numbers in this area, but you've also got to have the trusted people who we see time and time again make a big difference. And we've got to be deliberate about developing that cadre of leaders and future leaders, I think.
Very cool. Very cool. We'll come back to that in a sec, probably. But one of the things that I've always admired about the way that you approach this is the importance that you give to communications. And I saw a recent exchange you were having with others on the evidence ecosystem, where you were really emphasizing the role of communications within that. And it'd be good to just hear a bit more about your communications focus.
Yeah, and this is obviously people, play to their own strengths, right? So I have a bias because communications is what I have spent a lot of time learning about. It was always obvious that full fact could only work by communicating effectively. It depended on the behavior of other people, and therefore communications is a necessary part of our operating model. And so I spent a lot of time trying to learn from the best in the communications business. I did something called the Marketing Academy Scholarship, which is a leadership development program for chief marketing officers, which mostly done by people in ad agencies, major media owners like TV companies, Facebook, et cetera, amazing group of people to be part of. I did the account planning group, which is the essentially advertising agencies, strategy people. It's their trade association, if you like. I did their top strategy program, again, a selective entry thing, and a whole bunch of other work with, people who sell soap powder, because if you can make one soap powder seem different from another soap powder when it's not, then selling something that genuinely has value ought to be easy, right? And in the commercial world, you spend a lot of money learning how to do communications effectively, and you spend far more money on communications than the non-profit world or even the public sector, and therefore you do actually know more about it. And I think learning across sectors like that has been really important to me. And it is striking to me, I did a training program for civil servants who wanted to learn about using evidence. And in order to avoid patronizing them, my first question was, who feels confident about the difference between mean, median, and mode? Out of 60 people, sort of middle to senior civil service, who have volunteered to be in the session to learn about evidence, 2 put their hands up. And I was gobsmacked and slightly scared, but we started from where we were and they were keen, and that was good. But if I asked the equivalent question in a room full of people who lead organizations that depend for their impact on their ability to work with and influence other people, do you know the difference between system 1 and system 2? Do you know what excess share of voice means? I don't think I'd get any hands up in some of those rooms. And I think we have fundamental knowledge and skills gaps in communications in this field. We are not training our entry-level communications people properly, and our strategic leaders too often do not have and have never been supported to learn about strategic management of communications. And it seems like an open goal to me, obviously, as I say, coming from a particular background and a particular set of experiences. But if you take a bunch of researchers and ask them to lead organizations that fundamentally depend on their ability to communicate effectively to achieve their missions, perhaps at some stage you should teach them something about how you lead communications functions.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's very close to the heart. Policy is your king as well, because it is the way you draw people towards you. And it's got all sorts of other benefits. I mean, external communications are your best internal communications in a university, because you can't have internal communications channels don't work. So you need it. It's actually, you get more engagement internally from external communication. So it's kind of, it is viewing it in that way as many benefits is really important. So a kind of related idea about bringing that kind of more nimble outward focus thing. Explain a bit about your thinking about evidence entrepreneurship.
Yes, this is a developing thought, and I'd be really interested in how people react. But a lot of what we do in the Campbell collaboration and some of our best partners, which includes a lot of the What Works centers, is talking about identifying demand within government and public sector for knowledge and meeting that demand. And, you know, some of the toolkits, YFF, YEF, the Education Endowment Foundation toolkits, underlying them is synthesis, and it's all about meeting demand. But I come from a background of dealing with the fact that government doesn't demand evidence when it ought to, and is actively hostile to evidence a lot of the time. And that's not a criticism of the people. Some of the time it is, but it's also a fact of life about the political environment, which is an adversarial information environment where admitting weakness is not helpful. And the idea that we can succeed in creating what Donald Campbell called the experimenting society, or at least benefiting people by using evidence better, simply by hoping there'll be more demand or even trying to prompt more demand, I don't think is an entirely plausible theory of change, if you like the jargon. I think you have to go out there and actually sell. You have to come up with the evidence and you have to go out and sell it. And therefore you have to anticipate the kind of evidence that's going to be needed in 5 years' time, rather than hoping that a nice set of relationships with decision makers within government will tell you what evidence will be needed in 5 years' time, when all of those decision makers will have changed in 5 years' time anyway. Be there in advance, sell it when it arrives, and recognize, and this is the entrepreneurial bit of it, that that's a wasteful process. Some of the time you're going to be wrong about what you think the demand will be in 5 years' time. But it is much, much easier, as I think probably most people would recognize, to have some evidence in front of somebody before they've said something out loud and made a political commitment to something, to influence, to change the water that fish swim in, than to come in afterwards, as Fullfax spent most of its time doing, and try and change their mind by saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, Minister, but you're wrong. It's just a bad business.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, really interesting. And I've got one or two more questions, so do start thinking of your questions.
Yeah, sorry, I'll try to be brief.
No, we're good. So, I mean, it's just kind of last couple of bits. More generally, you've thought a lot about supporting learning and development within the evidence sector, and it's kind of come up in bits of that. But is there more to say about how we're actually doing that? So again, another issue very close to our heart, more from Chair of Campaign for Social Science role and Academy of Social Sciences role, but it's kind of we have some distance to go on that.
Yeah, and I think what is, I hope, very obvious is that I'm in a new job. I'm 6 months in, part of a new community, and I'm in a very exploratory phase of that experience. And so I'm putting ideas out there to get reactions and to learn, not because not because I think they're nailed. But the learning and development, you know, I pitched Fullfax for the first time when I was 24. Launched publicly when I was 26. I've been running it pretty much since then. And that could obviously only happen if a whole bunch of senior, incredible people took a massive risk on this annoying kid. And that's exactly what they did. And so we had this incredible group of trustees who actually launched Fullfax. Michael Samuel, the chair, Baroness Neuberger, Britain's second ever female rabbi, used to run King's Fund. Peter Archer, former Solicitor General, amazing man. And as I mentioned earlier, Jean Seaton and John Lloyd. And but also a whole series of other people. So Mandy Cormack, for example, a former senior vice president of Unilever, and trustee of Joseph Rowntree, who kind of took me under her wing and taught me how to talk to businesses, put me in front of, among others, the global chairman of Goldman Sachs, after spending months making sure I wouldn't waste that opportunity, if you see what I mean. Those are special investments that people have made in someone, and I'm the beneficiary of that, and I hope Full Fact's team was a beneficiary of that, and I hope everyone we try to serve was a beneficiary of that. But it's kind of haphazard, isn't it? And you think, who are we identifying who's 24 now, or 34 now, or 44 now, who we could be developing? And I think there's a real opportunity to say, who are the people who could be national statistician, for example? Denise Leavesley did her review of the UK Stats Authority, came out last week, and pointed out that there was a shortage of good candidates for national statistician. Why? Not because we don't have good people, but have we taken them and said, here's the set of opportunities, connections, pressures you need to become that great national statistician that you have within you? And I don't think we're doing that systematically. And I don't see that happening in other fields, which, I know less about non-stats parts of the evidence world, but I don't see that systematic program of what you would call it, I hate the jargon, but talent ID, talent pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the organizations in this sector are small. We can't do that entirely internally. That doesn't seem viable to me. So something about that being a shared opportunity seems massive to me. And of course, Campbell being this big global network, there's a really exciting thing. Technology is transforming our world. So not only do we need to train the next generation of people to enter that world and bring them to the latest technology, but we also need to take the people who are leaders now and give them the space to train the next generation of leaders. We need to take the people who've done the entry-level stuff and give them the space to lead their own projects and the support to lead their own projects. And what we want to build is a career development framework, a support, learning and development framework, whatever you want to call it, to support people at every stage of their involvement in the evidence synthesis process. And that should be more than about teaching them to do synthesis, should be teaching them to do leadership. I'd spent more than £1 million of other people's money, managed a whole bunch of people, and probably, well, I know for a fact, not done justice to quite a lot of those people, with nobody asking me, have you ever had any management training? Is that really how we want to develop the leaders of the sector? So I think there's huge opportunities there, and it's something I'm really excited about because I benefited so much from people being so generous to me. And yeah, I had the great pleasure at Policy Institute where I'm a visiting fellow, thank you, Bobby, to coach some of the participants in Policy Idol. It's such a pleasure. These undergraduates pitching policy ideas. And if you saw them on their first go versus them at the final on stage 2 days ago, it was a world of change from a very small amount of input from their coaches and stuff. There's a lot that senior experienced people, and I see a lot of you in this room, can do with relatively little effort to make the next generation something to be really excited about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is. When you see it in action, it's just amazing and inspiring when you see people go on those types of journeys. Very good. So I'm going to come to you. I just want to, there's one thing that you put on the list. It may look like we've rehearsed this endlessly because we're so smooth between us, but we haven't at all. So you put something about the missing museum. What is that? Was that a typo?
So speaking of exploratory ideas, why is there not a museum of social science? We have a science museum, right? Rows and rows of motors that don't move in glass cases. Really? Is that really the cutting edge of science? I think the most exciting thing to study in science is people and how we are and how we live together and all the rest of it. I think that's exciting science.
Excellent.
Where's the People Museum? So if somebody has a spare little bit of money, one of the things I'd love to do is get together with good social scientists and work out what are 5 or 10 really exciting, reproducible, properly scientific findings in social science, tell that story really brilliantly, get a spare shop in a shopping mall, put it up as a pop-up museum for a weekend and see if people like that idea.
Love it.
And when we prove that they do, we'll go to the Science Museum and say, oh, you missed a bit.
Yeah. Brilliant. I love that idea. Awesome. So great note to come to the audience. Any questions comments or reflections on
Heckles.
those? Yeah, heckles would be good. We've got Sarah right at the front. No, you crack on. Yeah, do you
I've
need,
got
I
the
think
mic.
you need the mic for online participants.
Well, you've got so many amazing ideas and things that have succeeded. Tell us about something that didn't work, because obviously we're all about what works, but also learning from what doesn't. Is there anything that hasn't worked, and what have you learned from it?
Well, I mentioned one, which was management, right? That's not been the thing I've, I had a wonderful team, and I learned a lot from my colleagues, who, Full Fact ended up for a particular period of time, and especially having an amazing culture. And that was primarily due, I think, to two people, Phoebe Arnold and Mevan Babica, who are essentially my partners in crime for the duration of Full Fact. And they shaped Full Fact's culture in a really amazing way. And I obviously hope I did my bit, but I had a lot to learn on that front. And I think that was a really important lesson learned. I talked about Parliament changing its corrections policies. Thing is, we knew we could get that change years ago, and we chose not to. We waited till we had a policy team because we wanted to get a bigger change, which was actually a mechanism to force members to correct the record when they got something wrong and they weren't willing to. Obviously, Boris Johnson is the sort of most top of mind example of somebody who repeatedly misled the House of Commons. He said that employment was going up when it was going down. This is not ambiguous. He acknowledged that that was wrong eventually, but without correcting the record, as he was obliged to as Prime Minister, and the parliamentary mechanisms failed to do anything about that. And we failed to make the case that that change is actually necessary. So I think there's a lesson learned there about it was right to wait for the opportunity where we had the ability to make that argument. The online safety bill was happening at the same time. So we ended up, I think, overcommitted on that front. But I also think we needed to do a lot more groundwork in terms of building a coalition around that and building parliamentary support before we took it to the procedure committee, which is, as somebody who'd worked in Parliament, frankly, entirely my fault, because, that wasn't a terribly surprising thing. But, sometimes you give things a go and that argument will come back around and one day we will win.
Very good. Other questions? Yes, one at the back there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Duffy. I'm the director of What Works at the College of Policing with the What Works Centre for Crime Reduction. I was just interested in what you were saying about learning from comms professionals. Maybe what was the most surprising thing you learned from them, and what was the thing that had the biggest impact on you?
I guess two things that are really fundamental, and many of you will do communications as part of your job. And the first one, the system 1, system 2, you have to communicate with emotion as well as logic, I think is at least theoretically known to most of us. But I think really embedding that in the way you do communications is a different exercise. One of the really interesting research findings in communications is that creative communications can be 10 times as effective as less creative communications in this case, moving sales, but there's no reason to believe that wouldn't be true in our field. And I think that creativity within strategy, within a communication strategy, is something we could make a lot more of. But the other thing, the really big thing from a strategic point of view, is excess share of voice. There's a book which is entry-level reading for people in marketing called How Brands Grow. And one of the big reproducible findings in marketing is that if your share of voice exceeds your share of market grows. That's known as excess share of voice. Now, if you think about our space, it kind of makes sense that the organizations that are successful in comms are so narrow that they are able to generate excess share of voice among a narrow audience. But the organizations that have less traction tend to be the broader ones, who actually are talking to a much wider set of audiences, but don't have the share of voice they would need to move their communications goals and therefore their business goals. And I think thinking seriously about excess share of voice would change the way people allocated communications resources and spent them.
Thank you.
Very good. Great. Yes, and One at the front, then one at the back. Oh, maybe one at the back, then one at the front makes more.
Hi, Rob Johnson, analyst at Centre for Cities. So I thought your line about government chooses ignorance was really interesting. So we've been kind of looking at evidence use in policy making from a local government perspective. And you can kind of provide synthesized evidence or data, and that's actually come on leaps and bounds in the recent years. But the fact is that this evidence-based policy making still doesn't really happen. So we think it's an incentives issue. So why isn't government incentivized to use evidence? Do you have any ideas as to how to incentivize government departments, civil servants, etc., to use this evidence that's out there?
So I think there's a lot of people in this room who could better answer that question than me. I would refer back to my full fact experience, which is don't treat it as one big problem, but try and break it down into individual solvable problems. One of those problems is clearly around skills, and everybody wants to sit the civil service down and train them in the use of evidence. And, you know, speaking as an arts graduate, thinks we should probably hire slightly more people who aren't arts graduates and all the rest of it. But there's that bit. There's definitely the politics of it. And I think perhaps this is a bit I can speak to with some authority. Full facts, you could argue, is the kind of militant wing of the UK Stats Authority. And that's not a coincidence either. There's been a long relationship between those two organizations. The former chief of staff of the Stats Authority became full facts stats advisor earlier on, and someone I learned a huge amount from and shaped our thinking. A guy called Mike Hughes, a wonderful man, and extraordinarily generous. Again, someone who just retired to join a bunch of 20-something-year-old oiks and guide us through in that way. Where's the militant wing of the National Audit Office? Like, the Taxpayers Alliance obviously is like occupying a linguistic space, but who are the people saying it is outrageous that you're burning our money in this way? Because if you're going to make this case, absolutely there's a carrot-based case, and we need to make that financial case in numbers, and we need to build the trusted intermediaries, and that's why I talk about personnel development. But we also just need to take the piss. It's hilarious how bad we are at spending money in some areas. And if you turn people into a punchline, they will pay attention. If you get their local newspaper saying, what on earth is going on, they will pay attention. There are political incentives on people. So we need to think about the political incentives, but we also need to think, there's one of the powerful things in, honestly, into politics space, for cognitive dissonance. Everybody thinks of themselves as honest. Everybody. It's really hard to think of yourself as a liar. And so when you point out to somebody, actually, you've got that wrong, there is a moment of cognitive dissonance if they're going to keep saying it, squarely confronting the fact that that's not true. It doesn't mean they're suddenly going to want to get a billboard out and say, I was wrong, everybody. But it might mean that they're less likely to say it again. And some of them do publicly correct. Where's the cognitive dissonance on, I think I'm good at being a counsellor. I think I'm good at being a senior executive or a senior civil servant. But I just wasted a bunch of money because we don't know what we're doing because nobody's checking whether it's working. Who's generating that cognitive dissonance? So I think there's a psychology of it. Then again, my bias is communications, right? That's the bit I know. There's a lot more about it, and other people can talk more about the structures and the incentives. But I think you have to break it down into different solvable problems. And there are some bits of that space we're not really playing in. And I find that really interesting. I think it's partly because the evidence community is naturally more comfortable in a collaborative and non-confrontational space. And obviously, I've just spent a lot of time in a highly adversarial space. So I have maybe a slightly different comfort zone around some of that.
Yeah, a very good perspective on that. Very different. Yes, at the front here again. Thank you.
Online as well.
Great. We'll come to that next.
Thanks, Will. Really enjoying this. Tom Smith from the Department of Levelling Up, previously Statistics Organisation, or ONS. Building a little bit on that last question, you've worked in small organisations, militant wings of various bigger organisations. What about lessons and thoughts back to those inside the system and inside the bigger organisations? How can we kind of learn a little bit from that?
Yeah, so Tom probably remembers I did a review of the ONS communications function for the national statistician with a wonderful woman called Claire Cowan, who does comms for Bank of England. So I wrote them down in a nice 7-page note that I'm assuming has been filed in a nice round file somewhere in Newport. But there is I guess there's several things, aren't there? One is I really would like to see inside the spending review process from the point of view of one of these bodies. I mean, the House of Commons Library is hilariously underfunded. The ONS is pathetically underfunded. And in particular, and Tom knows more about this than I do, but the idea that you can do digital transformation as an incremental thing, as a few % of extra spending, when what you're really talking about is moving from a horse to the car, you need to buy the car, train people to drive it. It's a fundamental capital expense that is, I think, not making sense in the way Treasury allocates money. So I find that fascinating. But in terms of lessons that I can actually teach, I think that, again, riding a hobby horse, if you work in an organization whose business goals can only be achieved depending on the behavior and choices of people outside that organization, then communications is an imperative part of your strategy. And you have to understand what it is you want your audiences to know, think, or believe, or feel differently. And then you have to resource for communications that can actually achieve those things. I haven't seen a serious attempt from within the UK's social science public information body, so the Stats Authority, House Commons Library, ESRC, Audit Office, etc., to do that and really make the case to their stakeholders of the transformational opportunities here. I'm not saying that would be an easy thing to do. I'm saying I don't think the senior leadership has ever geared up to give it a go. That would be my challenge. And to be fair, at least 2 national statisticians have heard me say that.
Great. So I'm going to see if we've got a couple of online questions, just to maybe see if there's 1 or 2. So we're coming up to time, but great to get their input.
Yep. So we've got a question from Melanie Field, who's asked, is part of the problem that the evidence can get in the way of political expediency? Politicians want to target the specific segments and constituencies that will get them power, so better to invest in unevidenced policy, which gains them support in the right place, than actually solving social problems. So how do we make effective policy more appealing to voters?
Nice easy question too.
Because the answer to part A is yes, as Melanie Field well knows, that very experienced civil servant who, among other things, led work on the Equality Act High, which I worked on. The how is the really interesting question. I had a conversation with a permanent secretary who shall remain nameless, and I discussed this question, and they said to me that the problem about having really accurate data on who your policies affect is you have really accurate data on who your policies affect. And if we don't want that, that makes our lives more difficult. And I think that is a hard political reality we need to confront. It's not true everywhere and all the time, but if you're hearing that from a permanent secretary to explain why the permanent sec cadre and the ministerial cadre don't want to support this work, I think that's really serious feedback that we have to take on board. I think the second kind of political factor is, by and large, they won't get the benefits if they put the effort in now. So if you spend money, resources, and energy this year, your successor, if they're lucky, will get the benefits of spending that. And that's a hard sell for a bunch of people with a lot of pressing problems in their in tray to do something which is sort of altruistic for the future in that way. So I think those are 2 really big political barriers for the top decision making that we do need to overcome. And partly, I think, sometimes you just don't want to point out the consequences too much. I think you can be artful about what you're selling and why it's beneficial for them. But I do think it's quite hard to imagine this happening purely from internal persuasion. I do think there needs to be a more small p political coalition around this work. So I found one of the most interesting projects we ever did was something called Need to Know, which worked with the Stats Authority, the House Commons Library, and ESRC to ask 3 questions about the big decisions the country would make over the next 5 years. Do we have the data we need? Do we have the analysis we need? And are we communicating it effectively? And we got 200 very senior people, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, head of the IFS, the Children's Commissioner, etc., in a room to ask those questions in the House of Commons and kind of come up with a roadmap for where are the gaps, what needs solving. Then the 2017 election happened and we kind of ran out of energy, unfortunately. But there's the blueprint of something special there, which is people who don't care about evidence for a living talking about what evidence they need. And the moment we will get serious change in this area, I reckon, is when the head of the CBI, the head of Cancer Research UK, the head of Britain's biggest businesses are turning up and saying this is a problem. And the closest we come to that, I think, is the Bean Review, where the Treasury decided that economic statistics had reached a point that was no longer acceptable, sent in an external reviewer, and ultimately ended up putting a lot more money in to support better economic statistics. You can see how business and the Treasury have the power to do that. You wonder where's the coalition that's going to do that, not just in statistics, but in evidence more generally. And that coalition isn't just a coalition of evidence people. It's a coalition of evidence people working with the people whose lives would be made better by having that evidence. And I guess that's a really interesting part of the comms goal, is building the crowd. Somebody told me recently that they have been asked to understand more about the stakeholder engagement of a large public sector evidence body. And that body said they had great relationship with business. So they said, oh, well, you know, please introduce me. They sent introductions, got no response whatsoever, tried again and got no response whatsoever. So I think it's pretty clear that there's at least room to build stronger stakeholder relations with people who don't see evidence as their primary day-to-day concern. And if we could move those people, then maybe we could move some of the top political decision makers in a slightly different way.
Great. Well, that's a really good point to end on, because I think it is through that collaboration and persuasion that we're going to make a change. So very best of luck with the Campbell collaboration.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure it is going to be amazing and make a real difference. Thank you, Will. But I'm going to hand back to Sarah.
Thank you both very much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you, Will, and thank you very much, Bobby, for the provocations. Thank you all for being a great audience and really good questions. Thanks to you who have joined online. We're always looking for suggestions for speakers to come and join us for this In Conversation series. So please do have a chat with Frankie or myself, and do stay for a drink if you're here in Albany House with us until 8 o'clock, please, so that the team can then go home. We do sometimes have some stragglers, but enjoy a glass of wine or a beer at the back. And thank you very much. Thank you.